vocabulary words. And now we are going to start talking about today's reading assignment. I will give you 2 poems by Robert Frost later, but first I'm going to give you a little bit of background about Robert Frost. So I'm going to open up a PowerPoint and we will talk about Robert Frost's life. So this is Robert Frost. Now, Robert Frost was born on March the 26th, 1874 in San Francisco on the west coast of the United States. Now, he was about 10 to 11 years old when his father died. And following the death of his father, Robert Frost moved clear across the country to Massachusetts on the East Coast. So he moved from San Francisco and on the West Coast all the way to Massachusetts on the East Coast. Now, after high school, Robert Frost attended Harvard University, and after studying at Harvard University for a while, he dropped out of Harvard University. Then later, he attended Dartmouth University, and again, he dropped out. Now, what I want you to know is that later, Robert Frost became a very successful poet. And I want you to realize that more than a few people have dropped out of college and gone on to become extremely successful people. For example, Mark Zuckerberg of Facebook, Michael Dell of Dell Computers, Bill Gates of Microsoft, Oprah Winfrey, who became the first African-American billionaire, and Steve Jobs of Apple Computers. All of these people dropped out of college and later went on to become extremely successful people. So college is important, but sometimes people do drop out of college and they go on to accomplish incredible things in life. Now, after dropping out of Dartmouth, Robert Frost later inherited a farm in New England, but he failed trying to run this farm. And again, I just want to point out that many people throughout history have failed at different things, and then they have gone on to become very successful at other things. For example, Abraham Lincoln once owned a general store with a partner. That general store went broke, and Abraham Lincoln lost everything he had. And he actually worked many years to pay off the debt for the store that went broke. But as you probably know, Abraham Lincoln later went on to become the president of the United States. So just because you experience failure does not mean that is the end of the world. Because one of the most important things you can learn is how to deal with failure. So when failure knocks you down, get back up, try again, do something else. And remember that failure is not the end of the world. So I hope that you find that word of encouragement useful. Okay, now, Robert Frost's dream was to write poetry, and all throughout his life, he wrote poems. And not only that, but he became very successful at writing poetry. And he became so successful that he won the Pulitzer Prize 4 times. He also became the Poet Laureate of the United States from 1958 to 1959. And he also had the honor of reading a special poem at President John F. Kennedy's inauguration on January 20th, 1961. And this picture shows him at the podium reading this poem for John F. Kennedy's inauguration. And so behind him, to the left, you can see John F. Kennedy, and then just to the left, you can see former President Dwight D. Eisenhower. And then just to the right, you can see the man whose head is turned. Well, that was Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson, who later became President Lyndon B. Johnson. So this was a great honor that Robert Frost had. And he has been one of America's most loved poets. And he often wrote about individualism and challenging social rules. And by the way, these 2 ideas, individualism and challenging social rules, are 2 very big parts of the American personality, of the American, they are both very important American values. So we can say that Robert Frost is a very typical American poet. Now we will start reading the poem Fire and Ice. So let me send you the handout Fire and Ice, okay? Now first, we are going to go to WeChat. And what I want you to do is I want you to write down all the words you can think of when you hear the word fire. When you hear the word fire, what other words do you think of? Okay, so here you go. And then what I want you to do is I want you to also write down all the words that you can think of when you hear the word ice. So I want you to write down all the words you can think of when you hear the word fire, and write down all the words you can think of when you hear the word ice. And I want you to take 3 minutes to do this. And I want you to go on WeChat, and I want you to write down your answers to these 2 questions. So please pause the video now, and then after I read your answers on WeChat, I will tell you when to come back to this video. So please pause the video now. Okay, now that we've talked about what you think of when you hear the word fire and when you hear the word ice, let's ask a few other questions. Which do you think is worse, fire or ice? Okay, which do you think is worse, fire or ice? Okay, and then think Also think about these questions. Which can do more damage and which is more unpredictable? So you have three questions here. Which do you think is worse, fire or ice? And which can do more damage? And which is more unpredictable? So you have 2 minutes to write your answers on WeChat. So please pause your video now. And then after I read your answers on WeChat, I'll tell you when to come back to the video. So please pause your video now. Okay, now that we've talked about those questions, let me read for you the poem Fire and Ice. Okay, so let me read for you the poem Fire and Ice. So please follow along while I read you this poem. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. So let me read that again for you. Fire and ice. Some say the world will end in fire. Some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if I had to perish twice, I think that I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great, and would suffice. So let's talk about this poem together. So, okay, so here we have this question. What is Robert Frost talking about or writing about in this poem? So I want you to write your answers on WeChat, okay? What do you think Robert Frost is writing about in this poem? Okay, now what Robert Frost is writing about in this poem is the end of the world. How will the world end? Will it end in fire or in ice? And that leads us to the next question. According to Robert Frost, how do people say the world will end? So please write your answers again on WeChat. Well, according to this poem, some people say the world will end in fire, and other people say the world will end in ice. Now, here are some good questions for you to think about. In this poem, what does fire symbolize? And in this poem, what do you think ice symbolizes? So what does fire symbolize, and what does ice symbolize? So please take a few moments to write down your answers to these two questions on WeChat. So pause this video for a few moments, write down your answers. I will read your answers, and then I'll tell you when to come back to the video. So please pause your video now. Okay, so you've written your responses to these two questions, and the fire in this poem, fire symbolizes desire. So if, for example, if you look back at what Robert Frost said, he said, "From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire." So fire symbolizes desire, okay? Because for him, desire is kind of like this fire that's just burning inside you. It threatened to go completely out of control, okay? And the next question was, in this poem, what does ice symbolize? Well, in this poem, ice symbolizes hatred. It symbolizes hate. So if you look at this, the second stanza of this poem, he says, "But if I had to perish twice, I think I know enough of ice to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice." So ice symbolizes hatred, because sometimes hatred can be very cold and indifferent, you know. You just hate someone so much that you're just very cold toward them. You're no longer warm towards them, okay? So, in this poem, Robert Frost is contrasting two different things. He's contrasting fire and ice. And because fire symbolizes desire and ice symbolizes hatred, he is contrasting desire and hatred, okay? Now, let's talk about a little bit more about this poem, okay? Because there is a little more background to this poem. Why did Robert Frost write this poem? Well, Robert Frost, all throughout history, people have wondered how the world will end. Because Western nations are influenced by the Bible, many Westerners think that the world will end in fire, because that's what the Bible teaches will happen at the end of the world, that the world will be destroyed by fire. But many scientists suggest that the world might end in ice long after the sun has died, okay? Now, Robert Frost also wondered how the world would end. A year before he wrote this poem, Fire and Ice, Robert Frost spoke with an astronomer named Harlow Shapley, and he asked this astronomer how the world would end. So Mr. Shapley explained that the world will either end in fire when the sun swells up and explodes, or if the earth survives the death of the sun, that the earth will end in a ball of ice. In addition to talking to this astronomer, Mr. Shapley, Robert Frost also read a poem, a very famous poem by Dante. Now, Dante was an Italian poet who lived in the Middle Ages, and he wrote a trilogy of 3 poems: the Inferno, Purgatorio or Purgatory, and Paradiso or Paradise. And in these 3 poems, his character journeys first through hell, then through purgatory, and finally through heaven. And so Robert Frost read Dante's poem Inferno, in which Dante gives a very vivid description of what he thought hell would be like. And so reading this poem and talking with this astronomer really got Robert Frost to thinking. And so this poem, Fire and Ice, is the result of all of that thinking that Robert Frost did about the question of how will the world end? Now, so now that you know that, let's talk about this question. What do you think is Robert Frost's message in this poem? So I want you to take 2 minutes to think about this question. And I want you to write your answers on WeChat, okay? So pause your video now, take 2 minutes to think about this question and write your answers on WeChat. And after I read your answers, I will tell you when to come back to this video. So please stop this video now. Okay, I enjoyed reading your responses. So the question is, what do you think is Robert Frost's message in this poem? And this poem is actually a warning from Robert Frost. He is warning his readers about the dangers of desire and hatred. Now, when we talked about fire representing desire, desire can also include lust, like when a man lusts after a woman, wants to possess a woman, or when people lust after certain things, they want something very much, okay? And it is a warning against hatred, okay? Now, what's also interesting about this poem is that this poem was written in 1920, which was only 2 years after the end of World War I. And during World War I, more than 10 million people died. And, you know, this was a horrible war that just devastated the world, caused untold suffering. And what caused this war? Well, there are several things that caused World War I, but certainly desire and hatred were things that helped cause World War I. And so Robert Frost and the rest of the world, which had just lived through the horrors of World War I, were very aware of how deadly desire and hatred could be. So this is the warning that Robert Frost gives his readers in this poem. So let's go to this slide and let's take a look at ourselves. Have you ever seen desire or hatred destroy someone? And if so, I want you to tell your classmates a time when you saw desire or hatred destroy someone. Now, we're having this class online, so I'm not going to ask you to tell each other right now about any example of a time when you saw desire or hatred destroy someone, but I do want you to think about this, and I encourage you to talk with each other about this. Now, there have been many times when desire and hatred have destroyed people. For example, I heard about 15 years ago or so, I heard about two boys who were students at Chungfa who both loved the same girl. And they both desired the same girl, but they both could not have her. So guess what happened? One boy killed the other boy by stabbing him to death. And why did he do this? Because he hated the other boy, and he did not want the other boy to have this girl. And so here, in this case, desire and hatred led to murder at Chungfa. Other examples of times when desire or hatred has destroyed people might be a marriage where the husband and wife have stopped loving each other, and their hatred leads to the death of their marriage. And maybe they got divorced, and maybe even if they did not get divorced, their marriage was still dead because there was no longer any love between them. So there are many sad stories, many sad examples of times when desire or hatred has destroyed people. So this poem is a very sober warning to us. Okay, now let's go to the next poem, The Road Not Taken. Now, for this poem, there are some different vocabulary words that I want to go over with you first. The first one is wood. A wood is a place with lots of trees. So in this poem, Robert Frost talks about being in a wood. So that's what a wood is. It is a place with lots of trees. Another vocabulary word that is found in this poem is the word undergrowth. Undergrowth is a dense growth of shrubs and other plants, especially under trees. So you can see here the undergrowth here of all these bushes and small trees. Well, this is the undergrowth for this forest. So that's what undergrowth is. Okay, the next vocabulary word is trodden. Trodden means pressed down into the ground by being walked on by many people. So here in this picture, we have a dirt path in the middle of a grassy field. And this dirt path has been created by people walking on this same path many times. And so because of that, the dirt has become trodden down by all these people walking along this path. Okay, the next vocabulary word is grassy. And grassy simply means lots of grass. So here we have a picture of a field with lots of grass. So we can say that this is a grassy field. Okay. Another vocabulary word is worn. Worn means damaged or pressed down after much use. Now, worn and trodden are similar in meaning, but they are slightly different, because you can also use worn to talk about clothes, furniture, and other things in addition to the ground. But you usually talk about trodden only when talking about a ground or a field. So that's the difference between worn and trodden. Okay, so now let me read this poem to you. And I'm going to read this poem to you, and then we will talk about this poem together. So I'll read this poem 2 times, and I'm giving you this will give you an opportunity to practice listening to the poem, and I hope, and some also many times poems are meant